Did you know that once upon a time, Israel attacked its strongest and closest ally, the United States? And they did it on purpose. I know you've probably never heard about it, but I'm not kidding. This wasn't an accident, misfortune, or even a conspiracy. It was much worse. Israel actually conducted an aerial and sea attack on an unarmed US Navy vessel, the USS Liberty, killing 34 Americans and injuring more than 170. Welcome back to the show. In today's episode, we see how Israel got away with murder, and not for the first time. Picture this. It was a sunny summer day on June 8, 1967. The US wasn't having a good year. Racial discrimination and poverty had sparked riots all over the country. The Vietnam War was raging and 10,000 US soldiers died that year alone. It was also the height of the Cold War, and US President Lyndon Johnson found himself close to a conflict in the Middle East. Israel had surprised the world and its Arab neighbors when it attacked Egypt on June 5, 1967, starting what became a massive land grab. To give you some context here, Arab powers like Egypt and Syria were backed by the Soviet Union, while Israel was backed by the US and allied powers. Back to that sunny day on June 8, the USS Liberty, a state-of-the-art US intelligence gathering vessel, was sailing across Mediterranean waters and into the war zone. The spy ship was in international waters, off the Egyptian coast in Sinai. Exclusive interviews obtained by Al Jazeera revealed the shocking details of the entire incident.
Our primary purpose was to intercept communications of the Russian spy aircraft as it were at Alexandria, Egypt, and that was our job, was to find them. We were not targeted against the Israelis.
At this point, the 1967 war had just 2 days left. Sinai, East Jerusalem, and Gaza had been seized, Jordan and Egypt had been defeated, and only Syria was holding out. The USS Liberty survivors all claimed that they couldn't hear anything from the Egyptian side.
The airwaves were dead. The only voices we did get were those of Israeli or Hebrew, was what we were hearing.
Israel owned the land and skies, and the Americans had been identified by their allies.
I was listening to the chatter the night before. They knew it was an American ship that came into the area. They knew who we were.
All morning on June 8th, an Israeli reconnaissance aircraft flew over the Liberty, knowing that it was an American vessel.
They were slowly lumbering over our ship, and we were waving at them, they were waving at us. And I felt that we were in great shape because they knew who we were.
They're our friends. We felt safe. Actually, it was a secure feeling to see them.
The Liberty was actually the only sizable vessel in the area that day. The ship even boasted a massive American flag that could be seen from miles away. The last thing that anyone expected was an attack.
Sun was shining, blue sky, clouds, nice, people sunbathing on the deck. We had lunch, and 5 minutes later maybe, here came the jets, and nobody really knew what was happening until they started firing.
Israeli military jets started opening fire at the Liberty. Surviving crew members recount how the Israelis fired rockets at the ship and jammed the signals so the crew couldn't request help, and then proceeded to drop napalm on the unarmed crew. And to top it all off, the Israeli Navy machine gun life rafts that the US Marines were using to escape death and get the injured away to safety. They then proceeded to torpedo the vessel in hopes of sinking it. The dog had bitten off the hand that feeds him. And so you might be wondering now what the US did about all of this. Surely they held the Israeli government to account, retaliated in some way, diplomatically, politically, economically, something. Well, no. The US did pretty much nothing to honor its victims, and the whole thing was covered up, which is probably the reason why you've never heard about the incident in the first place. Washington's first priority was to handle the media. They made sure no journalists could get access to the crew members or their families.
When they took the severely wounded to various parts, they actually posted guards on their rooms so that no one could be interviewed by the press. The total press blackout was in effect.
My husband was killed on the Liberty. And by the time I got there, there were any number of people from the National Security Agency there. They were there to make sure that I didn't speak to anyone from the press, and I didn't. They stayed night and day.
Despite the media cover-up, Lyndon Johnson was still facing a crisis. He spoke to Newsweek off the record about the incident, but then Tel Aviv got to work.
The Israeli embassy regarded this as a major problem, and that what Johnson had told Newsweek practically amounted to blood libel.
Alleging that he's blood libeling is going to arouse the Jewish donors.
Basically, threats of painting him as anti-Israel in the hopes of derailing his political funding. But Tel Aviv also dangled some carrots and offered up a few favors to buy his silence. At the time, Johnson was facing huge public pressure on the Vietnam War. Prominent Jewish leaders in the US, who were typically vocal in their criticism of the war, turned silent and stopped the Johnson bashing.
Leaders in the Jewish community were opposing him on Vietnam, and they were suddenly becoming more silent on Vietnam as the Liberty crisis moved.
And more concretely, Israel provided the US with samples of Soviet-made surface-to-air missiles that were giving them grief in Vietnam. So, to save face, an official inquiry was launched. The report was written in 20 days. It did not include many testimonies of the crew on board, no interviews with Israelis, and even the recording of Israelis identifying the ship as American were buried. 168 bags of American body parts were incinerated, and the cherry on the cake? The report exonerated Israel from any blame. And Tel Aviv danced to the beat, claiming it was a misunderstanding, a mistake, that no one was to blame. The cover-up was so bad that Johnson broke the long-standing American tradition of the president handing medals to veterans on national television. He avoided this duty to shun media attention and avoid meeting the Liberty survivors, and instead stayed in the White House to give high school students their diplomas. In the following year, American aid to Israel increased fourfold, and Johnson signed a classified treaty with Israel for the mutual exchange of intelligence, an agreement that is still in place. Yeah, it's all pretty hard to believe. Have stranger things happened?